Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Before, during, and after the Brexit campaign, the topic of Russia had been headlined. Does Russia benefit from this democratic vote? If so, how? Does democracy threaten European security? And will Russia continue to be blamed for Europe's woes? To Crosstalk Russia and Brexit, I'm joined by my guest in London, Domitila Sagromoso. She's a lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. We also have Jonathan Steele. He's an international affairs commentator. And we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Jonathan, if I can go to you first. We're after the vote. The vote was to leave the European Union. But during the campaign, the topic of Russia and Putin were mentioned, and in a very threatening way. Why was that injected into the campaign, and do you think it was effective one way or another?
Well, it was part of this Project Fear. They were pushing the idea that there would be economic disaster if Britain voted to leave, that the economy would fall, the pound would fall, that we'd be sunk in a kind of oblivion. And then they threw into the mix this security issue, saying the only people who would be satisfied if we left would be Vladimir Putin and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of IS, Islamic State. This was a ridiculous smear. There was no evidence of that. There wasn't a single speech or word from Putin that could be interpreted as having said that. So it was just fabricated.
Domitila, was it effective in any way? Do you think it influenced people? Because Jonathan is mentioning the security element of here. Obviously, the European Union and NATO have a very strong cross overlap, but it really was about the economic situation and policies coming out of Brussels that affected the UK, not Russia. But it still was mentioned.
Yes, I don't think that this scaremongering about Russia had any impact at all. I think I agree with Jonathan. It was used as part of this Project Fear, although unfortunately many of these predictions are turning out to be correct because we have a serious problem with the British economy at the moment, at the pound at least. So I think it was totally out of place, and I think it resulted from the fact that there is a perception that in Russia Putin is eager to weaken the European Union, to make sure that there is an end to the sanctions, and that Putin is sort of supporting far-right parties in Europe, and that there are close ties and sympathies. And this is underpinned by the fact that apparently, indirectly, Russia has been providing funds through a bank to the French National Front, and also to the fact that many in Russia seem to have been quite happy when Brexit occurred. I think I don't need to remind Russian listeners to that. But certainly the reactions in Moscow have been much more mixed than in other parts of the world, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, if I can go to Marcus, I mean, the reaction in coming out official Russia is that, well, the people voted. Okay, that's what you want to do with your fate, and that's your business here. As far as accusing Russia of funding right-wing groups and giving a loan to a Bank for the National Front in France, I mean, it was a private bank that did that. It's not an official transaction. So it was making a lot of noise out of nothing here. But Marcus here, I mean, hypothetically, I mean, how could Russia benefit from Brexit? Because it's going, if it does eventually happen, will Russia be a net beneficiary? Go ahead.
Well, of course, anti-Russian hysteria is historically a key feature of British politics. And of course, British politicians and British journalists during the referendum debate, I use the word debate in a very loose way because it was an appalling quality of debate. But the argument they put forward about Russia was that it would be in the interests of Russia for Britain to pull out of the European Union, because if Britain was to pull out of the European Union, that would trigger a domino effect, and other countries in the EU, such as France, the Netherlands, Denmark, for example, they too would hold referendums and they would leave the EU. So that was at the core of the argument by many people in the Remain camp as to why Putin or Russia in general would benefit. But certainly the two principal reasons as to which determined the outcome of the referendum was immigration and economics. But I would emphasise in particular immigration. I think it's fair to say that most people in Britain, they don't really understand economics. They don't really understand how the European Union works. But immigration, on the other hand, is a very emotional issue, and they understand that to an extent whereby they see immigrants on their streets, working in hospitals, etc. And that was critical in accounting for the victory of the Brexit camp.
You know, Jonathan, I can see from Russia's perspective anything that would weaken and slow down NATO would be just fine. Absolutely. That's very, very clear here. But let's stay with the European Union. How in the world is it to Russia's benefit to have to deal with 28 separate countries that currently are in the European Union? That's more of a headache. As a matter of fact, if you look at the entire last 16 years, Russia's made it very clear that it likes to work with a partner in Europe if that European partner really wants to work with Russia. It's a headache to have to deal with the Baltic republics, Poland, Germany, France, Italy, and Britain, and all the other countries separately. I don't see how any logical way you can say that that's to Russia's benefit. It is a gross negative, a net negative for Russia. Go ahead.
Well, I think obviously if the European Union totally broke up into 28 small states, that would not be the benefit of anybody, not to Russia either, because it would create chaos and uncertainty and all kinds of unpredictable consequences. But I think you could make an argument, I don't make it myself, but I think people did make an argument that for Britain to leave, Britain was seen as a hardline country in terms of keeping sanctions.
Yeah.
There was a big debate, there still is a debate in the European Union about when to lift sanctions or whether to relax the sanctions, reduce them a little bit because of progress after the Minsk agreement on Ukraine. Germany seemed to be more in favour of that. Britain was more against it. So you could argue, as I say, it's not my personal argument, but you could argue that get Britain out of the debate over sanctions makes it more likely that Germany gets the upper hand and there could be some reduction.
Well, that's an interesting take there. Domitilla, if I can go to you, because one can take another position in looking at that is that it was the Germans that were the really hardliners when it comes to sanctions, and Cameron just wanted to take a little bit of the credit because it's the Americans working more and more often directly with the Germans and not with Britain. With Brexit, does it weaken NATO? Now, that's something Russia would be very interested in. Go ahead, Domitilla.
I think that NATO will not be weakened by this. On the other hand, there is increasing talk about creating a sort of a very tight military cooperation. The French are talking about a European army. So in a way, there might be changes within Europe itself that I think Russia needs to watch very closely.
Oh, it is.
I tend to think that in a way Russia might benefit from its point of view, because I think the voices in favor of keeping sanctions up are going to be slightly diminished, because in a way, yes, the position of the UK on the one hand was a bit reluctant because of the business interests, but on the other hand there was a very strong sort of voice within the UK in favor of the sanctions. And I tend to believe that at least in the short term, the whole turmoil within the European Union is going to bring relations with Russia to sort of a second priority. So one could think that maybe in the short term, Russia may sort of benefit. On the other hand, we have seen that apparently the sanctions are still on after the meeting. It was said, 2 days ago, the EU Council that, these sanctions would not be lifted. But I mean, one cannot totally disagree that now the focus is not going to be Russia and Ukraine, although of course the situation will remain. And I think slowly the road towards lifting sanctions is there. Whether it will be affected by Brexit or not, I'm not so sure.
Okay.
But what is certain is that the European Union is going to be focusing a lot more on itself rather than on its relations with Russia.
Let me go to Marcus. Domitilla brings up a good point. I mean, maybe that's what the European Union should have been doing all along. Instead of meddling in Ukraine, causing trouble for Russia, it should have been looking at the Mediterranean a lot more closely. That's a security threat, not Russia, and I'll stand by that position very strongly. I think, this is a wake-up call to get your priorities straight. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, I think the decision of the British public to leave the European Union has shocked, has caused tremors throughout the European Union. And I think we can use the expression, it's a wake-up call. Now, maybe the EU's leaders will learn from the mistakes they've made in the past, which have been exposed during the referendum debate in Britain, and will seek to amend it. I think there's no question about it that if we're talking about the foreign policy of the European Union, it has been absolutely dreadful. It has helped to cause carnage in countries from the former Yugoslavia to Libya to Syria, of course, to Ukraine. But I think in regard to Russia, I think we should be clear about something. Germany was hesitant about placing EU sanctions on Russia. It was Britain that really exercised so much pressure on Germany, together with America, of course, and that accounts for why the EU placed sanctions on Russia. But let's also remember, many people in Berlin and Paris won't be so sad to see Britain leave the EU if Britain does leave the EU, because many in Europe consider Britain to be a troublemaker. They consider Britain to be America's main eyes and ears in the European Union, constantly feeding back everything to Washington that British prime ministers hear when they're in talks with the European Union. So if Britain does leave, perhaps, and I emphasise perhaps, there could be an opportunity for a slight improvement in relations between the EU and Russia, because Britain will be gone.
Okay, Jonathan, can you speak to that real quickly? I mean, if we see a final Brexit here, would that change UK's policy towards Russia in your mind?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think these tendencies of being very suspicious of Russia are deep in the sort of in the British establishment, and that will continue. I mean, I think that unfortunately the sanctions argument is pushed mainly by the Baltic states and Poland particularly, and they really have the dominant voice, and people like Angela Merkel even sort of give weight to that, because they say, well, these people understand the Soviet Union, Russia, because they were under the Soviet Union, they were sort of prisoners in that evil empire, etc., etc.
Well, see, I have to jump in here, Jonathan. We have to go to a short break. Let's not forget that Angela Merkel was in East Germany here. We're going to go to a break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Brexit. Stay with our team. Okay, Domitila, I'd like to follow up on something that Jonathan and Marcus had to say. Again, you know, we're in this huge uncertain time. A lot of hypotheticals can be drawn out here. Let's take the hypothetical here. The UK being a very hardline country on Russia when it comes to sanctions, at least rhetorically that has been true. But, you know, let's say with the Brexit, the rest of the countries in the European Union, do you see them going out a little bit more on their own? Because we did hear that the UK is the eyes and ears, and sometimes the voice piece for the United States and Europe. Do you think that could be some kind of divergence right there? And could that be some kind of issue for rapprochement? Because it's the Americans, you know, we've mentioned the Germans and the British, but it's the Americans that are the most hardline when it comes to sanctions. Go ahead.
Well, I think sometimes people forget that members of the European Union and members of NATO, I mean, at least at the European level, are more or less the same. So I don't really see that now this means sort of what we used to call a decoupling of Europe from America, or of Europe from the United Kingdom together with the United States. I think all efforts are going to be made to keep tight, close relations. This was reinforced by all states, the United States, NATO Secretary General. I think that this is not going to lead to any kind of breakup of the transatlantic relations. On the contrary, I think now probably the Americans are going to pay much more attention, especially if Hillary Clinton becomes the president, you know, to relations with Europe and to making sure they find a new voice within Europe. And I think Germany will always remain extremely relevant in the bilateral relationship. So I don't think that one can expect a significant change from the security point of view. On the other hand, as I said before, I think that there is an argument that can be made that now with Britain out of the EU, there is a possibility maybe for a better relation to a certain extent with Russia. But I agree with one of the previous speakers when he said that, you know, the Poles and the Baltic states are really pushing for this sort of more antagonistic relationship with Russia. And I think that is not going to disappear. And the Germans are probably going to be very receptive to the worries of these countries. countries. But again, I reinforce, I don't think this will be the top priority. And to a certain extent, it might, in the longer term, lead to a relaxation of tensions. So I think that the best... Sorry.
Yeah. No. I was just going to say, but Domitilla, if I can go to Jonathan here, it could go just to completely the reverse, because if we'll see the UK withdrawing from the European Council in dealing with foreign policy, the Americans will not really necessarily need to go to London anymore. They'll just go straight to Berlin. And if they want to double down, which they may double down, I mean, when Obama got pretty red-faced, Jonathan, with his visit to the UK and lecturing the British people about how to vote. The most reliable partner now is going to be Berlin, and I could see that if that's going to be the conduit, and what we've heard from Domitilla and Marcus about the periphery countries on Russia's border, they're going to want to keep a hard line. So it could go completely in the other direction where you don't get any kind of thaw at all. Go ahead.
No, well, I think the Americans have always seen Germany as the big player over the last 10 years or so. It's no longer Britain the big player, it's Germany, and they're much more concerned about German policy, the traditional fear that Germany would somehow go neutral or would even make an alliance with Russia against the West. All that kind of Rapallo thinking of the 1920s and 1930s is still there. And it's not surprising, although it was a kind of interference, that John Kerry came rushing to London and to Brussels and to Berlin after the Brexit announcement came, because it's not really an American issue, foreign policy urgency. But Kerry came rushing here to try and sort of say, look, don't start punching each other in the face. This is an important decision. It's not what we wanted, but don't let it get worse and worse and worse with a lot of name calling and shouting and so on. But I mean, basically, I think from the Russian point of view, the key election is the November election in the United States. They're much more worried, I think, Putin, about well, not worried, but they're much more interested about who will win, Trump or Hillary Clinton, than Brexit.
I'm sorry, Jonathan. That's absolutely not the case. There's a huge amount of resignation here. It doesn't matter which one shows up in the White House. It's not going to get better. It's probably going to get a lot worse with both of them. Marcus, if I can go to you, Kerry's little trip, to get all the children lined up, it's none of his business, nominally speaking, of course, but it of course is a very important concern for the United States. They want the European Union to follow line. They want to have a trade agreement that is beneficial to the elites. They want to make sure that NATO keeps the pressure on Russia. I mean, Kerry's appearance there is perfectly logical. It was the school monitor that showed up and keep everybody in line. That's exactly what Washington does, and that's how it treats NATO, and that's how it treats the European Union. Go ahead.
And Britain is very used to that. Why? Because since the Second World War, Britain has had, as we know what it's called, the special relationship with America. And Obama's intervention and Kerry's intervention wasn't unprecedented. Of course, during the 1987 election campaign in Britain, between Margaret Thatcher and Neil Kinnock, we had Ronald Reagan endorse Margaret Thatcher. So it's no new thing to British politics for there to be American intervention. But I think that going forward, I really do believe there's just an opportunity for slightly better relations between the EU and Russia. Yes, of course, in the early 1990s, America entrusted Germany unofficially to run Europe on the lines that America wanted. But Britain, America and Britain really are the countries who are leading the anti-Russian crusade in the world today. And Britain historically is known for its Russophobia, certainly within Westminster. And if Britain leaves the EU, and I'm not so sure that's actually going to happen, but if it leaves the EU, then there is a possibility that Russian and German and French leaders and Italian leaders they can speak in a more open way with each other, in a more effective way with each other, without the concern that, of course, Britain is keeping a watch over these discussions and reporting everything back to Washington.
Okay, well, the NSA usually does that for Washington. Domitilla, if I can go to you. If Brexit does come about, and I'm really glad that Marcus is stressing that, because there's still a lot of unknowns here. Will the European Union, minus Britain, now have to take care of Ukraine? I mean, is it going to be their writ now to take care of Ukraine? Because that issue there is far, far from resolved.
I think that the European Union has already decided to take care of Ukraine, so I don't think that will change. I think that we will see probably some concern to make sure that the Minsk agreement is implemented, although I mean, there are still a lot of obstacles down that road. And I think that the European Union and the Germans are going to make every effort that happens, because they see it in their interest also to lift these sanctions. So I think that there is sort of a double interest in that respect of both Russia and and the European Union to implement these agreements, so that they can at least go back and have a better trading and political relationship. Of course, the Ukrainians are going to insist on the question of Crimea, so that is still going to be an issue.
That's off the
which
table.
Is going to be,
that's off the table. It doesn't make any sense anymore.
Well, it's not off the table for the Ukrainians. I wasn't here, and they have repeatedly mentioned that.
Good luck to them, okay?
It will remain on the table for them, and as a result, it will remain on the table for the Europeans. So I think that this is going to remain an issue of concern. And I slightly disagree with the view of the previous speakers regarding, and what you mentioned, the United States coming back and putting everything online. I think it was very important, the reassurances that we received from the United States, that the alliance is not going to split up, that Europe is not going to collapse. I mean, many people here in Britain may think that...
That's in America's interest. Is that in Europe's interest?
And it's also in European...
Does Europe need to be going involved in these interventions for the United States? Is that in Europe's interest to fight these stupid wars? Really?
I mean, we are not talking about fighting every single war, but I think it is in Europe's interest to make sure that we have an alliance that protects our security. And as Europeans,
why don't the Europeans pay for it? If you're so concerned with it, why don't you pay for it? You want Washington to pay for it. If you're so afraid of security problems, why don't you pay for it yourself? Go ahead.
Could I say something, Peter?
Go ahead, Marcus. Go ahead. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Could I say something, Peter?
It doesn't make any sense. Go ahead.
I mean, it's not in the interests of Europe for Libya to have been destabilised. It's not in the interests of Europe for Syria to have been destabilised, and it's not in the interests of Ukraine to have been destabilised. And who is at the core of destabilising those countries I've just named? The United States. The refugee crisis, which is engulfing Europe. The
bombing of Syria and the bombing of Libya was initiated by the French and the...
No, before Britain and France intervened in Libya, how many refugees were fleeing sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa coming into Europe? Before the Americans weakened the Syrian government by supporting Islamist terrorists there, how many refugees were leaving Syria? No, I'm very sorry. Prior to both events, Europe was not suffering from a refugee problem. However, because of Libya, because of Syria, which is ultimately down to America, Europe is now flooded with immigrants. And I'm very sorry to say that with that, it comes a security threat. So for someone to say that the behaviour of the Americans in Syria and Libya is not connected to these security problems facing Europe now is bewildering.
Okay, Jonathan,
it's not bewildering. May I just say?
Go ahead.
It's not bewildering.
Gets the last word. Go ahead. Last word. Go ahead.
It's not bewildering because it was the Europeans, the French in particular, and the Brits, and to a certain extent, and not the Italians who moved into Libya. And the Americans were very reluctant.
The Americans gave them the green light. The Americans gave them the green light.
They did not.
The British and the French would not do anything without American consent.
Okay, we've run out of time just as things really got started. Many thanks to my guests in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.